The call came on a Tuesday morning in February, right when I was sitting in the parking lot of a Service Canada office, trying to work up the nerve to go inside and file for EI. My grandfather had died. That's not exactly the shocking part. He was 83. He'd had 2 strokes in the last 4 years, and honestly, the last time I'd visited him up in Timmins, he'd looked at me with this expression I can only describe as someone already halfway through a door. I'd driven the 6 hours north from Guelph on a long weekend in October, and we'd sat on his back porch drinking Timmy's and watching the birch trees go gold. And he hadn't said much. He never said much. That was just his way. What shocked me was what his lawyer told me after. "Your grandfather left you the property on Kessler Lake Road," she said over the phone. Her name was Miss Park, and she had the careful, neutral voice of someone delivering news she'd delivered many times before. The house, the outbuildings, and just over 40 acres of boreal forest. I didn't say anything for a second. "There's also the matter of back taxes," she continued. $41,000 owing to the municipality of Timmins. The estate has no liquid assets to cover it. You'll need to make a decision within 60 days, or the property goes to a tax sale. I sat in my car and stared at the Service Canada office. Inside, there were fluorescent lights and a number dispenser and people waiting in plastic chairs. Outside, apparently, there was a 40-acre problem in northern Ontario with my name on it. $41,000. I had maybe $900 in my checking account. I'd been laid off from my project manager job in November when the firm I worked for lost a big infrastructure contract, and my severance had already gone to 3 months of rent and a car payment I was already behind on. The timing of all of this was, to put it gently, spectacular. My mother called that same afternoon. My grandfather was her father, but they hadn't spoken in years. One of those family fractures where the reason has calcified into something no one can quite remember anymore, and everyone's too proud to be the first to forget it. She didn't cry on the phone, but her voice had that particular tightness that I knew meant she'd been crying before she called. "You should sell it," she said. "There's a resource company that's been sniffing around that area for years. They'd take it off your hands. They'd bulldoze it," I said. "That's not your problem, Evan. But here's the thing, it sort of was, because my grandfather had left it to me specifically. Not to my mother, not to my aunt in Sudbury, not divided among all of us. To me, by name, with a handwritten note attached to the will that said only, 'Don't be hasty.' 2 words, from a man who'd spent 83 years on this earth. That's what I got. I didn't go inside the Service Canada office that day. I drove to a Tim Hortons, ordered a large double-double, and sat there until the afternoon crowd started filing in, and I thought about my grandfather, about what I actually knew of him, which turned out to be embarrassingly little. His name was Robert Kessler. He'd been born in a small town in northern Ontario, the son of Finnish immigrants who'd come over after the war. He'd worked for the Ministry of Natural Resources for 30 years, something to do with land surveys and resource mapping, and then he'd retired to this property on Kessler Lake Road, which he'd built himself in the late 70s. He'd been widowed when I was 4. He kept to himself. He had a workshop in the back where he made things out of wood. Small, careful things, boxes and frames and little puzzles with interlocking pieces. He gave them as gifts and never signed them. That was the whole of what I knew. The drive to Timmins in February is not something anyone does for pleasure. The highway north of Sudbury goes flat and white and endless, birch trees lining both sides like gray stitching, and the temperature when I pulled off onto Kessler Lake Road was -27. I could feel the cold through the door of the car before I even opened it. The house was exactly as I remembered it, a low, careful structure, well built, the logs chinked with something my grandfather had always maintained himself. The metal roof had shed its snow cleanly. The woodpile under the lean-to on the south side was, astonishingly, still half full. He'd cut and stacked it himself the previous summer, at 82 years old. There was a birch tree in the front yard that had grown to maybe 30 feet tall, and my grandfather had nailed small wooden platforms to it at intervals, like a staircase going nowhere, because he'd told me once that he liked to think about the squirrels having a way up and a way down. I stood in the driveway in my inadequate city jacket and felt something I didn't have a name for. Not quite grief. Something older than grief. Inside, the house smelled like wood smoke and machine oil, and something faintly herbal. He'd kept dried plants on the kitchen windowsill, though I couldn't have told you what any of them were. The wood stove had been cold for 3 weeks, but the insulation in the logs was so good that the temperature inside was still hovering around 5 degrees. I got a fire started with the dry birch rounds from the box beside the stove, and while it caught, I walked through the rooms. It was a small house, kitchen, living room, 1 bedroom, a bathroom added on in the 80s that never quite matched the rest. The workshop was a separate building out back, about the size of a double garage. I'd been told not to bother looking for a safe or any hidden documents because the lawyer had already been through everything. The estate was simple, she said. No surprises. I almost believed her. The first night, I slept on the old pull-out sofa in the living room because the bedroom felt too intimate, somehow, like I was trespassing. I woke up at 2 in the morning to the sound of the fire settling in the stove and lay there listening to the absolute silence of the boreal forest, which is a particular kind of silence you don't get anywhere else, deep and cold and attentive, like something vast is holding its breath. I started going through his things the next morning, not looking for anything in particular, just trying to understand the life. There were bookshelves along the whole north wall of the living room, filled with the kinds of books a man accumulates over a long life. Field guides to birds and trees and geology, a complete set of the Canadian Encyclopedia from 1985, paperback thrillers with cracked spines, a few volumes of poetry in Finnish that I couldn't read. On the shelf at eye level, there was a row of identical hardcover notebooks, maybe 15 of them, numbered on the spines in my grandfather's precise handwriting. I pulled the first one down and opened it. It was a survey log, dates going back to 1971, grid coordinates, notes about soil composition and water table and rock formations, professional records from his years with the ministry. I put it back and pulled down the last one, number 15. The date on the first page was 2019. My grandfather had been retired for over 20 years by then. I sat down on the floor right there, in front of the bookshelves, and I read. It took me 3 hours to get through it. My coffee went cold. The fire burned down and I didn't notice until the room got too cold to ignore. What was in that notebook was not a survey log. It was something else entirely. Careful, methodical, written in the same precise hand as the survey records. But the subject matter was a mining exploration company called Ridgecroft Resources. And what my grandfather had been doing for 7 years was documenting what he believed was a systematic pattern of fraudulent environmental assessments in the watershed north of Timmins. He'd kept copies of documents. He'd mapped illegal test drilling sites. He'd photographed disturbances to the land and cross-referenced them with Ridgecroft's official filings with the provincial government, and the 2 sets of records didn't match. Not even close. I turned the pages slowly, reading his notes in the margin. He'd been trained as a surveyor. He knew exactly what he was looking at, and what he was looking at, apparently, was evidence that Ridgecroft had been running exploratory drilling operations on Crown land without proper permits, falsifying the results of environmental impact studies, and lobbying municipal officials in Timmins with what he described, very carefully, in the language of a man who'd spent his career in a government ministry, as irregular financial consideration, bribes. He meant bribes. At the bottom of the last page, in handwriting that was shakier than the rest. This must have been recent, the last year or two. He'd written 2 lines. The property on Kessler Lake Road sits on the northern boundary of their target area. They have approached me 3 times. I have declined. And then, below that, Yvonne will know what to do with this. I sat with that sentence for a long time. The workshop out back was locked with a padlock I didn't have a key for. That seemed significant, suddenly. My grandfather had a thing about locks. He'd always said that a locked door was a statement of intent, and he was a man who chose his statements carefully. I went through every drawer and tin and hook in the house looking for the key, and I found it eventually in the most obvious place possible. Under the wooden squirrel platform, on the birch tree in the front yard, tucked into a small magnetic case. He'd left it there for me. He'd known I would think to look. The workshop was extraordinary. I'd been in it before, as a kid, but I'd seen it the way a child sees a grandfather's workspace. A place of interesting smells and sharp tools and things you weren't supposed to touch. Now I saw it differently. The workbenches were clean and organized, tools hung on pegboard, with the careful precision of someone who'd spent a career making measurements. There were shelves of wood stock along one wall, sorted by species and size. On the bench nearest the door, there was a half-finished box of bird's-eye maple, joints cut but not yet glued, a project interrupted. I stood there looking at it for a while. He'd been working on it in the fall, maybe. Right up until he couldn't anymore. The back wall of the workshop was floor-to-ceiling shelving, filled with flat wooden drawers, the kind used for storing blueprints or large paper documents. I started opening them. Most held what you'd expect. Paper patterns for woodworking projects, technical drawings, a few old ministry maps. But in the third drawer from the bottom, I found something different. It was a large envelope, sealed, with my name written on the front. Inside was a USB drive and a handwritten letter. I sat on the workbench stool and read the letter twice. My grandfather's handwriting, the careful, upright hand of someone who'd learned to write when penmanship still mattered. The letter was 11 pages long. He'd started writing it 2 years earlier, he said, when Ridgecroft had approached him for the 4th time. This time they'd sent someone in person, a man named Dumont, who'd arrived at his door on a Saturday morning in what my grandfather described as a vehicle that cost more than most people's houses and offered him $420,000 for the 40 acres. Cash, fast close, no questions. My grandfather had said no. He'd been saying no for 7 years, he wrote, because he understood what the land was. Not just his land, the whole watershed up there, the way the boreal forest worked as a system, the lakes and the wetlands and the slow, cold rivers feeding down from the shield. He'd spent his career studying exactly this kind of terrain, and he knew what Ridgecroft was after, and he knew what it would cost. He'd tried reporting it through official channels. He'd written letters to the ministry. He'd filed a complaint with the Ontario Securities Commission about the false filings. Nothing had happened. I am not naive, he wrote. I understand that I am one retired civil servant with notebooks full of observations that any decent lawyer would call inadmissible. I understand that Ridgecroft has people. I know who those people ain't too. I have documented them. The USB drive, he explained, contained scanned copies of every document he'd collected over 7 years. The survey data, the photographs, the correspondence, copies of Ridgecroft's false provincial filings, alongside his own field records showing what was actually on the ground. He'd also included financial records he'd obtained. He didn't say how, showing what he believed were payments routed through a numbered company to 2 members of the regional municipal council. I could not go to the media, he wrote. Not at my age, not alone, not without risking everything I have left. But I am not leaving this world having said nothing. I am leaving it to you. You are young. You are careful, and unlike most of your generation, you still believe that things can be made right. Don't stop believing that. He'd signed it with his full name, Robert Ano Kessler, the way he'd signed every official document in his career. I sat in the workshop until the temperature dropped enough that my breath started fogging, and I thought about my mother telling me to sell, and about the Service Canada office I'd been sitting outside in Guelph, and about the man in the expensive vehicle who'd knocked on my grandfather's door on a Saturday morning, and I thought about $41,000 in back taxes and what $400,000 would do for my actual life versus what I was looking at right now in my hands. I put the USB drive in my jacket pocket and went back inside. The next morning, my phone showed a missed call from a number I didn't recognize, a 705 area code, Northern Ontario. I didn't call back. An hour later, a black pickup truck came slowly down Kessler Lake Road and stopped at the end of the driveway. It idled there for about 2 minutes. I stood at the kitchen window and watched it. Then it left. That was the moment I understood that my grandfather hadn't been writing to me from some peaceful, removed place of old age wisdom. He'd been writing to me urgently. He'd been in a situation, right up until the end, and now the situation had transferred to me the same way the property had, with my name written on it. I called a friend from university, a woman named Katrina, who'd gone into environmental law and was now working for a nonprofit in Ottawa. We hadn't talked in 2 years. She picked up on the second ring. I told her everything. She didn't say much while I talked, which was characteristic of her. Katrina had always been a person who listened until she had something worth saying. When I finished, she said, "Don't send me anything yet. Don't email anything. Don't upload anything. Where is the drive right now?" "In my jacket pocket. Keep it there." A pause. "Your grandfather was methodical?" "His notebooks are numbered. He indexed them." She made a sound I recognized as approval. "Okay, I need to make some calls. Give me until tomorrow morning. And Evan, stay in the house." That second night was the longest of my life. Not because anything happened. Nothing happened. The forest was silent. The stove kept the room warm. A Canada jay came to the platform feeder. My grandfather had mounted outside the kitchen window and ate sunflower seeds with businesslike efficiency. I found a half-empty bottle of rye whiskey in the cupboard above the fridge and poured 2 fingers into a coffee mug and sat at the kitchen table with the notebook spread out in front of me, reading from the beginning. He'd been keeping these records since, before I was born. Not always about Ridgecroft. That was only the last 7 years. Before that, it was other things. Water quality observations in the lakes around his property, bird counts going back to the early 80s, weather data, photographs of the same tree, photographed in the same spot every spring for 40 years. He'd been watching this place the way you watch something you love, systematically, over a long time, building a record that no single observation could build. I understood, reading those notebooks, that this was not a man who woke up one day and decided to fight a mining company. This was a man whose whole life had been an act of attention, and the fight was just the logical end of that. Katrina called at 7:30 the next morning. She'd spoken to a contact at the CBC in Toronto, an investigative journalist named Ms. Obi who covered resource extraction. She'd also reached a professor at Osgoode Hall who specialized in environmental law and had looked at 3 similar cases involving falsified provincial filings. "They want to see the materials," Katrina said. "Not copies, the originals or the best documentation trail you can show. Your grandfather's notebooks count. The USB copy counts as a starting point, but we'll need to establish where the originals came from." "He references his sources in the notebooks," I said. "Every document is cross-referenced." Another silence. "Evan, your grandfather might have built the most thorough informal evidence file I've ever heard of. He was a surveyor for 30 years, I said. He believed in documentation. What happened next took 4 months, and I can't tell all of it because some of it is still working its way through processes that don't move fast. But here's the shape of it. Katrina connected me to Ms. Obi, who came up to Timmins with a researcher in March, and they spent 4 days going through the notebooks and the scanned files on the drive. The journalist was a careful, quiet woman who asked questions the same way my grandfather wrote. Precisely, without extra words, she said after 4 days. "This is real." The story ran in May. I won't tell you it was a simple or clean outcome, because that would be a lie about how these things work. Ridgecroft's lawyers issued statements. The 2 council members my grandfather had named hired their own lawyers. The Provincial Ministry of the Environment announced it was opening an investigation, which may or may not mean something. But the documents were public now, and the false filings were part of the public record. And Ridgecroft's stock dropped 18% in 3 days, and their board replaced the CEO within a month. The property on Kessler Lake Road is still in my name. I applied for and received a grant from an Ontario land trust to cover the back taxes and conduct a proper ecological survey of the 40 acres, which my grandfather would have been unbearably smug about if he'd been around to see it. The survey found 3 vernal pools he'd documented in his notebooks that hadn't appeared on any official ministry map. I moved up in April. Not as a permanent thing, I told myself, just until the summer, just until things settled. That was 3 months ago, and I'm still here. I've been going through the notebooks in order, all 15 of them, and I've been adding to them. Not with the kind of data my grandfather kept. I'm not a surveyor. I don't have his training. But I've been photographing the same birch tree he photographed every spring for 40 years, standing in the same spot, in the same light. He didn't tell me to do that. I just figured it was the right thing. The half-finished maple box is still on the workbench in the workshop. I looked up the joinery technique he was using. It's called a hand-cut dovetail, which is apparently one of the harder things to learn to do well, because the fit has to be precise or the whole thing falls apart. I've been practicing on scrap pieces of pine for the last month. I'm not there yet, but I'm getting closer. On the last page of Notebook 15, after my grandfather's final 2 lines, the ones about Ridgecroft approaching him and about me knowing what to do, there was one more thing I missed the first time I read it. Right at the bottom of the page, very small, in handwriting that was shaky enough that I had to take it to the window to read in better light. He'd written, "The squirrels know their way up and their way down. You will too." I don't know how long I stood at that window. Long enough for the Canada jay to come back to the feeder outside and stare at me with one bright eye, the way birds do, completely unimpressed. I put the notebook back on the shelf in its proper place, number 15, and I went out to the workshop, and I picked up the chisel, and I got back to work.